and thanks very much to Springhill for hosting us here. I was going to ask you lot to the back whether you want to transplant to the front, but you don't look like you want to. You can just collect these chairs and move them away when you feel but this is an intimate conversation, obviously, and we want everyone to be involved, so feel free to more or less chip in at any time. We're doing this very informally, and this is the day 4 now of a whole tour that we've been doing, focusing on climate change at different museum locations across the province. And it's been really fascinating for me. I've been lucky enough to chair each one of these, sort of kind of curating a conversation, if you like. And the first one we did in Belfast, we talked about politics. The second one, which we did over in, you can remember.
Downpatrick.
That was at Downpatrick. That was more focused on ecology. Then yesterday we were over at the planetarium in Armagh, and we talked about land use and farming a bit more substantially. We can have different elements of those conversations, I think, with the panel that we've assembled for you tonight. I think this can be quite a wide-ranging discussion. We can touch on all these different elements of the sort of the historical, the land use, the ecology. We've got Jonathan here from the RSPB. And the way I want to do this, rather than introducing everybody and reading out sort of a CV, is actually just to invite each of you in turn to stand up, use the lectern if you like, pace up and down if you want to, and just give us your 5 minutes really on who you are. So introduce yourselves, tell us your expertise, your area of interest, and just give us a bit of a pitch just to sort of set out the stall for the conversation. So we might as well just go in order of how you are. So Jonathan.
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invite this evening. I'm Johnny Bell, and I'm the head of Land and Sea Policy within the RSPB in Northern Ireland. So I sit within our policy and advocacy team, and my day job essentially is around trying to influence government policy on the environment, and particularly on biodiversity. And that includes a variety of land use issues, from agriculture to climate to peatlands, forestry, you name it, and also on the marine side as well. So just as a way of context, the RSPB is a charity campaigning and working for a world richer in nature. We work across the UK and 4 countries. We have partners in the south in terms of Birdwatch Ireland, and also we have a reach across the world in terms of BirdLife International. So we very much are a global organisation. And my day job essentially involves trying to help tackle the climate and nature crisis that we're facing. In Northern Ireland, we're about the 12th worst in terms of biodiversity loss of all countries in the world. We've lost 97% of our species-rich meadows. Many farming birds have experienced declines of up to about 80% since the 1980s or 1970s. So we really are facing a biodiversity crisis. At the same time, we're facing a climate crisis, and that's a little bit, I suppose, there's been more profile perhaps given to the climate crisis and understanding of the role of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And in Northern Ireland, we're a climate laggard. We're well behind what other UK jurisdictions are doing. Average greenhouse gas emissions have reduced by about 49% across the UK on average. In Northern Ireland, it's 19%. Introduction of the UK Climate Change Act in 2008. Off the back of that, since then, Northern Ireland emissions reduced by 9%. In the rest of the UK, they reduced by 30%. We didn't have any Northern Ireland specific climate legislation until historically last year. For the first time, we passed the Northern Ireland Climate Change Act. And that took civil society, it took the third sector. The Minister was not going to introduce a Climate Change Act until the third sector and civic society came together and tabled a private members bill. And it was that really forced the Minister's hand in terms of bringing in climate legislation. So we now have a Climate Change Act with a net zero target for 2050 with a methane exemption in there. For us, and one of the most heartening things to see, I suppose, in the legislation was a clause around nature-based solutions. So that where practical, the departments must try and invest in nature-based projects as a way of tackling climate change and making us more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So for us, nature-based solutions is key. Climate and biodiversity are 2 sides of the same coin. We can't tackle one without tackling the other. And very often the focus is on climate and carbon. We can't forget about the natural environment. The descriptive report that was commissioned by the Treasury last year talks about our natural environment. It talks about our economy being imperiled and humanity being imperiled if we don't respect our natural environment and boost our natural capital. So it was a really seminal report, and we definitely have a look at it. So for us in the RSPB, in terms of pulling together our climate and biodiversity work, we're really looking at nature-based solutions. One example is around peatland restoration, a project we undertook with Northern Ireland Water in the Garran Plateau, restored one of the largest areas of blanket bog in Northern Ireland. As a result of that restoration, we're avoiding about 9,000 tonnes of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere every year. And as a result of that, we're seeing nature actually recolonise the peatland habitat. So we're seeing the invertebrate life, because the water table has risen, the invertebrate life in those peatland pools. As a result, we're seeing more meadow pipits, skylark, and obviously the birds like the merlin and hen harrier feed off that. So you can see how that has a knock-on impact and a positive impact for nature. So investing in the restoration of the natural environment is a key tool for us to create jobs, tackle climate change, improve water quality, prevent flooding. Nature can do it all for us. We just need to invest in it.
Thank you. That's an excellent introduction. Thank you, Annika.
I'll stand over here. My name is Annika Clements. I'm Director of Nature, Climate and Environment at Ulster Wildlife, which is possibly the most intimidating job title. And I'm going to sort of give you a little bit about my own background, because it would explain why I have certain biases towards the things I'd like to talk about. So I'm actually a marine ecologist by background. You can probably tell by the accent that I'm not from here, but I came to Northern Ireland 20 years ago specifically to work on mapping our coastal habitats, our seabed habitats, to help with the marine protected area network development. So just as we have protected areas on land, we also have quite a few at sea. So I was helping provide the evidence base for that. And it's been a really interesting journey. In that time, we've seen the changes in the government departments. So when I came in, it was Environment Heritage Service. And then we had Department of Environment and DAR, Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. And we saw them come together, which was actually a really important thing, because we always had agriculture sitting separate from environment. And I know that that was a big challenge, but from someone sitting kind of on the outside, it was really good to see that. I then worked also at UU up in Coleraine, and I then worked for Northern Ireland Environment Link, helping look at state of environment reporting. So that's really everything from air quality, water quality, to countryside statistics as well. And then I went back to the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, which is a bit of a mouthful, but they help provide evidence again in support of what is now DERA, the Department of Agriculture, Environment, Rural Affairs, on marine things. So again, back to marine protected areas, but also doing fish stock assessment, which was quite a nice insight. I did my PhD part-time while I was working on fishery stock assessment, so I have a love of the Dublin Bay prawn, which many people don't realise is our largest fishery. A lot of people, if you say what's our biggest fishery in Northern Ireland, think it's actually a fish, but it's not, it's a prawn. And the interesting thing about this sort of personal journey, I guess, is that I've watched the on the seabed, the changes of climate change already coming into play. So, for example, we have something called the spiny spider crab. There's a fishery for that in Cornwall, but we now have seen it track around the west of Ireland onto our north coast. When I first came here, we would have seen one or two in a couple of years, but gradually over the years now we're seeing more and more, to the point where somebody said, well, we might be able to fish them soon. I'm not so sure about that, but and that's just one example. And then with my Dublin Bay prawns, they're very restricted to an area in the Irish Sea that's driven by an oceanographic gyre, so it's like a big circulation that keeps them in the right place. All their larvae get entrained there, and the right type of mud for them to live is in that part of the sea. However, climate change is changing the temperature of the oceans, it's changing the acidity in the oceans, and it's actually changing the patterns of wind that affect that circulation. If that circulation changes, that habitat changes. So that's just one example of what we're seeing in the marine environment, which is quite hard to sample, but we're seeing a myriad of similar things on land. So that's just in my sort of 20-year career in Northern Ireland, seeing that in a personal way. And what it's really made me realise, I have 3 children, and they do have what I would call eco-anxiety, but they also have a degree of feeling that they can't do anything. And as a parent and as someone who's worked in the environmental sector for a long time, I don't want that. I want them to feel empowered. I want them to feel that there are solutions. And I also want them to show an interest in the wildlife around them, because it has changed a lot. You know, where I live, we used to have skylarks around the house, and then The land got bought, it got drained, as so often happens, it became improved grassland, and the skylarks disappeared. So there's lots of little stories, and I'm aware that there's things I knew as a child, like hearing the cuckoo, that I've only heard a couple of times in Northern Ireland, and they should be there. So, and kestrels is another example. I grew up in the south of England, you see a lot of kestrels, not many buzzards. Came here, buzzards are on the rise, but kestrels are still, if anything, they've declined. So I'm very aware that we're losing things before some people even know them. The younger generation isn't necessarily even aware of what they're losing. But as Johnny so well explained, nature also provides a lot of the solutions to climate change. So I think what we have to do now is really see that opportunity and engage everybody in that, whether they live in a city or whether they're lucky enough to live in a nice rural area already wildlife rich, but to see what everything we can do together to really address climate change, because we are locked into a degree of change, and I think that's the difficulty. We need to do everything we can to cut emissions, but we will still already have climate change for at least the next 100, 200, 300 years. So in the lifetimes of our children, they're going to see drastic changes in our weather patterns. So we need to sort of learn how to adapt to that, but also keep doing everything we can to cut our emissions. Thank you.
Iain.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand well back from that coffee. My wife said I'm the kindest person she knows, and that could just go everywhere. My name's Iain Greenway. I am Director of Historic Environment Division and Department for Communities, so I came with that other bit of DOE that didn't go to DERA. My professional background is as a mapper. I came here to work in Ordnance Survey Northern Ireland, having worked in Ordnance Survey Great Britain, not so far away, south of England, and Ordnance Survey Ireland. So I've done the trip, one of only two people we believe to have done the trip around all three. I then did some odd stuff around regulating taxes and stuff, and then came into historic environment. And in 2019 I was appointed climate change lead for the Department for Communities. And I'm just about to relinquish that job because now there's going to be a full-time climate change director in the department rather than it being bolted onto another job. And that, I think, shows how far this has come. And when I look back at presentations I gave 3 years ago around historic environment and the work of our division, you do a quick word search, have a quick look, climate change wasn't there at all on the slides. Now it's almost that first slide. It's come centre stage quite quickly. That means, because in Northern Ireland we were starting from a low base, John has given the figures, I had them written down here as well, honest. And then we lurch towards what is a horrible, horrible incoherent piece of legislation. It doesn't make sense within itself. Clauses disagree with other clauses. It had 70 changes made 3 days before then going through the final stage, before the Assembly fell at that point. And it's a mess. It sets a radically ambitious target beyond what science says is possible for Northern Ireland, and what the scientists agreed made sense. 82% reduction is 100% reduction. It's great to have ambition. Now, I'm the sort of guy that gets lobbied by these sort of guys, although she's about to come over to my side of the fence in the next month. How are we going to make it happen?
You heard it first here.
Oh, sorry, was that it? Well, it isn't anymore. Right, apologies. I'm coming with a built environment background. We've heard some good stuff there, really good stuff on the natural environment. The built environment is a big creator of carbon, emitter of carbon. Building stuff creates carbon, costs carbon, running stuff and knocking stuff down. And here we have done too much building stuff and knocking stuff down. And we keep doing that. I would say with my heritage hat on, we do far too much of it. Why not repair a sash window rather than put a double glazed unit in? But that hadn't been a mainstream voice. Shiny is good. We've now got to a position where we can do quite a lot on reducing the emissions of buildings through decarbonising the electricity supply, through retrofitting insulation, all of that stuff, heat pumps. But we've then got that massive piece of what they call whole life carbon around the construction and the deconstruction. But just to give you a few figures, if we wanted to make all our houses in Northern Ireland SAP Band C, which is pretty average, it's not anything near a passive house, that's going to cost us £2.4 billion. Who is us? Big chunk owned by the department via the housing executive, big chunk funded by the department through housing associations, big private rented sector and growing private rented sector, and an owner-occupied sector with or without mortgages. If we want to get to SAP Band B, which is starting to push the science and push those limits, 9.2 billion. That's just for Northern Ireland. Housing Executive, 2 billion to do that, because it's got some pretty poor specification homes, many of which actually are going to have to come down. They won't be able to meet those standards. And apart from the money, technology, a lot of it not invented yet to do a lot of this, finance, supply chain, skills, all of those things are struggling. And what the industry is saying is it needs medium-term certainty about our flow of work before it skills people up, before it invests in stuff, which absolute common sense. And what are we doing as a government? We're doing annual budgeting and all of that stuff at the moment. Great opportunity, of course, in all of this, in the middle of every difficulty lies opportunity. Innovative finance, new science. Kennedy says the man's going to go to the moon in 10 years. They did, but look at all the scientific stuff that's still coming through. How can we use savings that are in credit unions? How can we use money that's getting 0% on cash ISAs? How can we cycle that in? And it was great to see, it's not one piece of paper, I picked up the Royal Society of Ulster Architects. They've now got a very pithy paper about what does the built environment need to do for climate change. It needs to say in planning policy, you can't knock anything down without a special permission, whereas at the moment you can more or less, unless it's listed, knock it down at will. Our building regulations are years behind what they are in England, and even England's aren't enough to get to net zero when we need to get there. We are still building stuff that will have to be retrofitted in 10 years' time because people build to the minimum of building regs. Minister Hargey, before she left office, instructed the Housing Executive and housing associations to go beyond minimum compliance, but it will still need retrofitting. And just because in any speech like this I can't not talk about the wonderful work that the private sector is doing. The Southwest College campus in Enniskillen, and the Iain campus, Passive House, that is first in Europe of that scale building, but they struggled to take photos of that building without showing all the car parking they've had to put in because it's outside the town centre. They knocked down a 1960s hospital, which in turn had knocked down a Victorian workhouse hospital. Part of that workhouse is still there and has been refurbished with heritage skills and brought back into use. They came out of a big building in the centre of the town that's still sitting empty with heritage assets, the old jail behind it. So real challenges there. Where did I go? Real challenges then for us as policymakers in government departments about, and it's a point Annika picked up as well, is I don't know, and I should know for heaven's sake, is it better for me financially and for the planet if I spend some money on putting new light bulbs in or getting an electric mower rather than a petrol mower? Which thing is better? So how do we help people understand that? We as policymakers, we as lobbyists, we as members of the public. And then I did just want to mention a little bit on heritage. Heritage does respond to struggle with climate change differently than other assets. We've got a lot of state care monuments in my care, Dunluce Castle, Devonish monastic site, wherever, stones above head height. We've been going around touching them. We're up on cherry pickers and scaffolding, touching them because actually drones and everything else don't really tell you what it's like there. Everything is worse than we anticipated. There are areas closed at Dundrum Castle, there are areas closed at Dunluce Castle, there's areas closed at Armagh Friary. Areas at Newton's Priory that were all redone 20 years ago are going to have to be done again. And it wasn't because they were done in a shoddy way. This is how climate is impacting. Same in Scotland, where it's similar stone, similar climate, similar techniques. So it is struggling. Johnny mentioned, or somebody mentioned peatlands. Under those peatlands that we're going to have to restore is masses of archaeology from millennia ago. What will the impact on that archaeology be as we rightly deal with the peatlands? And one of you also mentioned changing directions of winds. Armagh Cathedral is leaking. Water is coming through the tower, the Anglican cathedral, because the wind's coming from a different direction. So the building has had hundreds of years getting used to wind from rain from a particular direction, it's moved to a different direction. The Dean told me that some years ago. I told some architects, and one of the architects said, that's really interesting. I'm the architect for the Catholic Cathedral at Armagh, and we've been seeing exactly the same thing. So it's interdenominational climate change as well.
But there'll be some good things.
Heritage assets are struggling to cope, as society is, but heritage is struggling in particular. But yet heritage and reuse is part of the answer to this. So there's another circle running around alongside all these other things.
Gosh, well. So what do you want to talk about? Prawns, peatlands, or heat pumps? I mean, it's almost it's such a varied
or all three
conversation we can have here. Yeah, I mean, all of these things are interconnected. I mean, the built environment you mentioned, obviously, is a huge source of emissions, but it's also a opportunity to reduce them, and it's also being affected by climate impacts. And so your cathedral's example is about adaptation, I suppose. Same goes for the natural world as well, and for peatlands in particular, both currently a source of large amounts of carbon, hopefully a sink of even larger amounts of carbon when they're fully restored and have all of the different components of the ecosystem which enable them to accumulate carbon. In terms of the offshore environment, I'm really fascinated by, if we could start with that, by what you were saying in terms of the different fisheries, how they've been shifting things. How do you kind of map a sort of sustainability approach on that? Because we hear a lot about overfishing, trawling in particular. I don't know how sustainable the prawn fisheries is. Probably not very, because they don't tend to be. But you know, do you actually see that climate is affecting the marine environment in a way which is comparable now to direct human impacts from fisheries and other disturbances?
I think the problem is that you're now trying to tease apart what's the impact of fishing versus what's the impact of climate change. So the example locally would be cod. So before there was a Dublin Bay prawn fishery, there was a very successful Irish Sea cod fishery and haddock. And in fact, the vessels that are now fishing for prawns have basically been re-rigged to fish for prawns after the cod fishery collapsed. So there's been a lot of management measures put in place to try and help that cod fishery recover. You know, there used to be cod that were 4 or 5 feet long, regularly caught. There's lots of beautiful historic images of small children holding these cod. We do not see cod that size at all anymore. So what we see is very few cod, and we see much smaller body size, and that's a typical sort of indication of an overfished population. And without a doubt, it was overfished. But why is it not recovering when we've put all this management in place? So there's a cod closure every year over a big area of the whole of the Irish Sea to allow them to spawn and to hopefully help them reproduce. But that's been in place for well over a decade, and it hasn't had any real impact. What we've discovered instead is that, of course, the sea is getting warmer, and cod actually like really cold water. So a lot of the cod that you'd buy at fish and chip shops is coming from Norway and Iceland, because that's where it's still sustainable. There's still good stocks there. And so you've got this overlay of trying to restore something, but actually its range is having to shift north as the sea temperature rises. So we're used to having, you know, fisheries are usually managed by a single species, and there's a quota provided. The stock assessment is done by a single species. But that's not going to really work, because we're going to have this overlay of change. So there's a new provision in the Fisheries Act now about ecosystem-based fisheries management. It's in the joint fisheries statement that was recently agreed, and that applies to all of the UK. And that's really trying to incorporate looking at multiple species together and looking more about how do they function rather than what's the individual species. So, you know, what things are living at the bottom and what's eating what. So it's like a much more ecosystem-based approach. And to have then that assessment flexibility that quotas will need to change based on what the pressures are coming from climate change. So it's a really different way of all the types of fisheries assessments we've done before, but it also means that the consumers need to change their preferences. So sometimes, you know, we're very used to eating cod and haddock, but that's all shifting north out of our waters. So if you're buying it from, you know, Norway and Iceland, you've got more air miles to try and, you know, there's a carbon cost there. And in fact, the sustainable stocks that our Marine Stewardship Council approved are those stocks, but to get them here, you're obviously flying it in. So there's a real change of, you know, can we eat more locally? Can we eat a wider range of species? There's a lot of talk about eating lower down the food chain has less impact. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but it really requires this knowledge that things are going to keep changing, and we have to be flexible in that way.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just want to ask, because I know you're talking about the seas, but I'm thinking more local about Loch Ness. And there's been massive changes being seen. My father-in-law is a fisherman for 40 odd years, 50 years. And there's a lot of changes happening within the loch. And I'm just wondering, where does that fall into, or who looks after that, or who's doing any studies into what's happening, and all the sand barges and the damage that that's doing, you know. So I just don't know Or who's sort of...
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously big challenges in the freshwater environment. I don't know if any of our water bodies are in good ecological status. Lough Neagh, there's a lot of tributaries that run into it, so there's big challenges there, particularly around the land uses around Lough Neagh. Highly intensive agriculture and runoff is not good, obviously, for the quality of the water within Lough Neagh. And there's obviously been the dredging issue over many years, which has gone on, I suppose, without planning permission. And again, that's quite a controversial issue. So yeah, water is massively important to us as a society, and it's been one of those big things that we've really struggled in terms of tackling. But it's not just as simple as, fix that river. It's all the water that runs into it, the runoff, so it's the land use surrounding that's critical.
We even heard earlier in the week that it may not even be possible to go back to the peatlands to even restore them, because the rainfall, totals are so low now in some of the summer months that the water table is going to be below where you need it to be anyway, and so the peat then oxidizes, and the ecosystem won't be able to support itself. So we've got to think about the fact that, as you said, in the marine environment, this is a constantly changing climate now. You can't go back to any particular single state and say, right, this is where we want to preserve everything for, right? I mean, how does that come into your conservation strategy with bird life?
In terms of?
Well, how everything's changing, how the ecosystem is basically in constant flux now.
That's it. I mean, we talk about, I suppose, resilience of, say, seabird populations or farmland birds, and there's so many pressures. So it's not just one pressure, as Annika spoke about. It's not just climate change. So it's that myriad of pressures, and that's why we need resilient seabird populations. So one of the big ones, for example, has been avian influenza and the massive impact that's having. And it's very hard to tackle that issue in isolation because birds are mobile species. So that's why we need to look at what are the other factors that we can actually boost the resilience of our seabirds, so that if there is an avian influenza outbreak, they're more resilient, can cope and can bounce back.
And is there anything you can do on that, or you just watch there passively as they all die off? I mean,
what there's biosecurity issues. Yeah, I mean, as I said, they're mobile species, and it's a very, very difficult one to tackle. Can I just come back to the point of the climate change legislation very briefly? Just on Iain's point, I totally agree. The legislation that the government produced is very unwieldy, and it is quite difficult to navigate. And
what's the target again? Net zero by
2050, but
with a methane exemption.
Yeah, 46% reduction by 2050.
Not more.
Not more than.
Is that for livestock?
Yeah, methane. Yeah. Right. So obviously that was an amendment that was pushed quite hard by the agriculture lobby, but I wouldn't say that net zero is unscientific. All the sort of global literature out there, the IPCC is saying we need to get to net zero. There's not a legislature in the world that is not legislating for net zero right now, so it would be highly peculiar for Northern Ireland to have legislated for 82%. And it's not unscientific. The advice from the UK CCC was that an 82% reduction was more palatable politically and economically for Northern Ireland. It wasn't saying we can't get to net zero, it was saying that they think there'll be a disproportionate impact on the agriculture industry here. But democracy played out, legislation went through the House, and we have what we have, so now it's up to government and others to try and implement what we have as ambitiously as possible.
I mean,
you need to
clarify that, because you weren't saying it was unscientific to have a net zero target, were you?
The 82%, which is what the UK Climate Change Commission came up with as an equitable share of, without getting all geopolitical, we are a sub-nation. 82% was a fair share, an equitable share for Northern Ireland within a net zero in UK of 100. Now, of course, mathematically that means somebody's got to get to
negative
minus. But Lord Deben, the chair of the committee, said, quote, that will be bloody difficult, unquote. And very unscientifically, we produce a lot of meat here that people in GB eat. The emissions happen here, the benefit of it happens over there. That, very crudely, was the basis of saying not everything needs to be equal. Democracy did play out. Whether the science will enable democracy to achieve what it wishes to achieve, which means all of us as individuals changing our behaviours, etc., etc.
But it's not the science that can't achieve net zero. I mean, you could stop emissions tomorrow. Yeah. It's the economy that will suffer, and politically what's palatable.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the one thing, is that certainly as a wildlife charity, you know, we now recognise climate change as the single biggest threat to nature, and we've actually just developed this last year, a new sort of policy through to 2030, our own corporate strategy, where for the first time we've put climate right in there. Whereas before, you know, it was seen as a wildlife charity that climate change was sitting somewhere on the side. But now we realise everything we're doing, you know, if we're not tackling climate change as well, is almost a lost cause. But there are some very difficult decisions as a wildlife charity to sit behind. So, for example, we have a very ambitious renewable energy target, which is necessary to get towards our net zero. But we do have difficulties with renewable energy, both on land and at sea, in terms of the impacts on wildlife. So, you know, it is very difficult if we're saying, you know, climate change is the single biggest threat to nature, so we have to tackle climate change. And a lot of that is through things like, you know, changing the building stock, looking at how we're doing powering our homes and everything else. But that also then has an impact on wildlife.
I was trying to persuade Johnny before we started that nuclear was the most environmentally friendly zero carbon technology, which I believe as an environmentalist, but I probably don't want to go into that. But where are you with wind turbines, like onshore wind, let's say?
Yeah, I mean,
because I know the RSPB sometimes campaigned against them, sometimes in favour. Is there a kind of a cross-standard policy, or does it just depend on where you are?
It's site-specific considerations. It's about the right turbine in the right place, just like it's about the right tree in the right place. The pattern of wind turbine development in Northern Ireland has been large single turbines scattered across the countryside. There was no strategic approach to how we went about it. In the offshore environment, it's going to be slightly different because it's obviously you don't have separate landowners. Crown Estate owned land or owned seabed. So what we need to make sure we're doing there is a spatial approach. What happened on land was very much the market decides. The market was the one pushing single turbines across the countryside, and it's not a very strategic approach. Whereas, like for example, in Wales, they had strategic search areas, which gave certainty to industry, certainty to communities about where they'd be best located. And I suppose one of our big issues here is our grid infrastructure is so deficient. So we are used to transmitting electricity or power from a number of centralised power stations in Northern Ireland. Now with a lot more decentralised power coming on from solar panels, wind turbines, the grid can't cope. So grid improvements are required, as well as the interconnectors. So the north-south interconnector, again requiring an upgrade to ensure that there's greater energy or electricity interdependency between the jurisdictions. So on any given day, if it's really windy in the south but not up here, that the electricity can be.
Is there any interconnected to Scotland as well?
Yeah.
There is, yeah. But they're not functioning anywhere near, I think, as efficiently as they should be.
And what about just on this point? What about offshore wind? Is that completely? You can have 100,000 turbines in the Irish Sea, and that's all good to birds, or is it?
No.
Is there a limit there
all
too?
Good, in terms of flight path, turbine size, the number of turbines. So we need a spatial approach. We need to map out our sea area, and we need to, we've got a marine plan, for example, but it's not spatial. It's not setting out this is where things should and shouldn't go. So we need to just think carefully, make sure we do the adequate research and mapping before we just go hell for leather and say, right, we'll stick turbines there and then regret it. And that's the one big thing, just and Iain has touched upon this, that it is going to be a huge challenge achieving net zero, and there are unintended and perverse consequences potentially. If we go carbon at all costs, we as a charity are very aware that biodiversity in nature can be the very thing that will suffer as a consequence. So we have to be very careful.
That makes sense.
There's somebody right at the back there.
Who is
standing up.
Oh yes.
Just two things. First of all, we live in a great realistic building, and the environment people say that we can't put in double glazing because it's out of keeping with the property. Yet we have to burn more fossil fuels to keep the house warm. And then it's a turf fire. We're not going to burn turf. Yet in Mid-Ulster has the biggest exporter of peat and peatlands in Europe. And there's container loads leaving Belfast port daily, shipping our land, for better word, across the world, and nobody's saying anything about it.
But they are though. Isn't that meant to be being phased out? The actual industrial extraction
Hasn't been agreed here. Hasn't been agreed here yet.
I can't believe it still happens at all. But yeah,
other jurisdictions are.
The biggest exporter of peat in Europe is in Mid-Ulster.
Crazy. Well, what about the buildings issue though?
Yeah. the priority initially with buildings was decarbonising the power grid. Now, of course, as been mentioned, the power grid doesn't get everywhere, and there's a lot of local stuff needed, hence the pushing towards heat pumps and other things. So that was an initial wave of trying to reduce carbon emissions here. In terms of listed buildings, my staff are sick and tired of me saying to them we cannot end up on the wrong side of this debate. If heritage is seen as a blockage to climate change, it will be pushed out of the way very quickly. And there will be many lining up to say heritage is the blockage. The developers saying, well, we can't reuse that thing, we're going to have to go and build another one over there because the heritage people say we can't do that. So we're being pushed into the line of fire anyway, but we can't put ourselves there. So what is our view on solar panels on listed buildings? They're on the roof of Edinburgh Castle, they're going on the roof of King's College Chapel in Cambridge. Where can't they go? And they're they're reversible, minimal intervention, reversibility, all of those things that one thinks through. So windows, real challenge. Secondary double glazing we say is fine. Refitting the primary double glazing we say isn't. That's technology and materials are moving on so quickly that perhaps doesn't apply anymore. So I am pushing that very hard to say if we get on the wrong side of this, there won't be a wrong side to be on.
You can get a sliding sash window.
You were saying about restoring the sash window rather than
yes.
But that's a single glaze. You're pumping heat out through it.
But materials are now getting to the point where the putty, the scale of the window, will cope with double glazing. That's we're pretty much at that point now for some configurations of the classic sash window, 6/6, 1/1, etc. Not all of them yet. So I don't like it when we end up writing back to somebody saying we'll just put thicker curtains in, because I don't think that's really part of the answer. Although the rooms, of course, are all getting warmer, so maybe that's less draft anyway.
Are there certain
She's making curtains today.
are there certain instances where you have to accept trade-offs? Because I know in terms of nature and carbon, there are times when there's a bog, for example, that we don't want to re-wet because the marsh fertility is there and their larvae will get flooded. So we don't re-wet to maximise carbon and ecosystem services. Instead, we're maxing out the benefit of the habitat for the marsh fertility. So are there similar trade-offs in a built environment?
There are similar trade-offs. Every listed building in law here is equal, whether it be a single cottage somewhere or whether it be Armagh Cathedral, just because I've used that example previously. By law in England, the grades mean something and differentiate between things. They don't here, but common sense needs to prevail in this as well. So where can we make the trade-off? Because the trade-offs are being made for other reasons. There's a case the Historic Buildings Council get very excited about at the moment at Ebrington Square, the new hotel in Ebrington Square in Derry, where the council decided to allow replacement windows, even though it was listed, which they got the power to do, and there's checks and balances around all of that. So it's happening anyway for other reasons, spurious or otherwise, I wouldn't like to say. But the climate is an overriding reason. So we need to respect that and sort ourselves out. And as I say, my staff are sick and tired of me saying, let's not get on the wrong side of the argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've mentioned a few times how technology might really help us. And I think that's the one thing when, you mentioned about Lord Deben and the Climate Change Committee recommending initially that Northern Ireland's target should have been 82%. And that was mainly because there wasn't a viable pathway now to get to net zero by 2050. Not to say that there wouldn't be one in the future, but just literally looking at what we had at our disposal, the types of technology and the way our land use is structured and everything, that we couldn't get there. But they were saying, as Johnny said, that we should have ambition and that technology will catch up. And as you were saying about the materials for sash windows, it's similar actually with offshore wind turbines. They're now looking at the old school ones where all fixed to the seabed and they were, not huge. Now we're seeing massive ones that are floating technology and they're sort of anchored by these long chains, which actually means they don't have as much impact on the seabed, but they are much bigger structures, but you don't need as many of them. So there's all these trade-offs, like in theory, does that mean they're going to impact the marine environment less, but provide more power? There's a lot that's kind of constantly coming online. So for Northern Ireland, we haven't got any offshore wind yet. But they're now saying that by 2030, or 2032 might be more realistic, we will have the offshore floating wind. So these new floating wind turbines is what they're looking at. And so for us, as a wildlife charity, we're trying to figure out, what's the impact of that and what can we learn from others, because we're slightly behind other nations in doing this, which is a good place in some ways because we can learn from the mistakes that others have made and wait for the technology to catch up. And the other thing I guess we should say is we're talking about trade-offs. It's now already basically acknowledged that offshore wind will impact the environment. So at a UK level, they are devising a compensation scheme. So it's not mitigation, it's actually saying there is going to be an impact. So we have to compensate the marine environment, and they're going to be providing funding for like habitat restoration projects and other initiatives that help conservation. It's not ideal because you are not going to be replacing like with like. That's the fundamental truth, that we're going to see changes in the marine environment that we may not really be comfortable with, but that is what's needed to try and get us towards net zero.
Okay.
So it is a very difficult balancing act.
Right. Any other thoughts or questions or anything from the floor?
The peat point was a good one that we did touch on.
Who raised the peat point?
It was just about the peat extraction.
Standing at the back.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well,
Yeah.
I literally can't believe that this is still happening.
Yeah, I mean, peat cutting and using peat and burning peat in households, it's etched into the fabric of rural society in Ireland, so it's culturally quite a contentious issue, but the direction of travel in the context of the climate and biodiversity crisis is for peat extraction to be phased out. Now, peat extraction used to be by hand, with a more limited impact, if you like, but I suppose in the 80s, 90s, even earlier, machine cutting came in where vast swathes of sort of peatland habitat were destroyed, and that was for the use of peatland in composting, for burning, for heat in households. We have a peatland strategy in development here in Northern Ireland. It's been in development for some time, and there is a a draft sort of commitment in there around phasing out peat extraction by 2025. I think following the consultation, it's been watered down to, I think it's considering, or Sarah might know more, but looking at looking at the possibility of peat?
I think it is more doing to consider options.
Consider options around phasing out. So
I think the issue is then that the other parts of the UK are moving to ban the export of it.
Yeah, because there's some industrial peat extraction in the north of England, I think, but not much. I mean, but you still see in the garden centre, and most of their compost contains peat, which is pretty extraordinary, really.
I think those proposals are all out now, but I think I think the department will come under pressure because it means that we're going to be like a back door or a front door for peat products.
But from a lay person's perspective, it just seems to be a box ticking exercise. All of these aspirations.
Yeah.
For somebody who's just sitting, just a normal person, it's just a box ticking exercise. It's the same as COP26.
Yeah, and
What's happened?
But there's so many strategies and policies in development within government, and what we need to do is move towards implementation as quickly as possible.
Which would be ourselves
and the difficulty is with the political vacuum, we can't get to sign those things off and move to implementation, and that's the challenge. But in terms of an industry, in terms of peat extraction, it is going to be phased out. I think 2025 will probably be the deadline for it in terms of extracting for compost or for burning.
What are you calling for? I mean,
we are seeing. Well, I want to see it phased out by 2025, and I want to see people who are employed in peat extraction repurposed and retrained into actually restoring peatland.
Right.
So people, commercial.
Yeah, commercial, and I think there's a big issue here around turbary rights, around rights that come with owning a house in certain parts of the country. So people have turbary rights attached to that household, and they're allowed to go and hand cut. So again, the option there is to try and buy out those turbary rights, but trying to distinguish which homes have turbary rights and which don't is very, very difficult.
And which are even using them.
And it's a highly complex issue. And who's exercising them? Yeah. We are seeing more people go back to the bog now, cost of living crisis, fuel price crisis. So people are going to cut turf again, unfortunately. But the best value of peatland to a community is to keep peat wet and in the ground.
Yeah, just because it's historic doesn't mean it's sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. It's a double whammy. You're destroying a huge carbon store that actually can sequester carbon through the vegetation on the peatland, and then you're going and burning it. It's a double whammy.
Are there issues with...
Sorry, I was just going to suggest that probably the majority of people here are preaching to the converted, or at least people who are... How are you going to get get this message across to the people who are causing the most damage, the big industries that are doing all the damage. Like, you know, say that we're on the ground here, we're all doing, I'm sorry, assuming, but we're all doing our wee bit. Yeah. And all those wee bits do obviously help, but whenever you have those big companies that are causing so much damage, how do you get into
There's a push and there's the pull. There's the policy side of things and the regulation that needs to come in. But on the other side, there's also the consumer, because we're the ones that consume it and buy it, and we need to encourage people to stop buying peat-based compost, and that's quite difficult. So for us as an organisation, it's working with government, encouraging them to be as ambitious as possible, undertaking restoration on areas of peatland where we have an opportunity to do that, either in partnership with others or through acquiring a piece of peatland. So it's doing it on the ground and showing that restoration is possible. And we've done that up in the Garran Plateau, where we, in partnership with NI Water, actually re-wet that bog. They blocked about 1,000 drains across the site, the largest area of blanket bog in Northern Ireland, and the water table has risen. As I said, the invertebrate life is recolonised, the sphagnum moss is recolonised, and that is helping to purify the water, reducing the turbidity of the water that's running into the NI Water reservoir. So they're seeing reduced costs in terms of having to clean the water. NI Water, one of the biggest users of electricity to clean our water in Northern Ireland, and they're seeing the nature-based solution, that is, restore that peat. It acts as a natural sponge, as well as then the capturing 9,000 tonnes of carbon a year, and also providing obviously a home for nature.
And I'm being selfish again, thinking of Ulster.
Yeah.
I always, whenever I was in work, I always felt whenever there was funding and things being given out, I always described ourselves as the centre of a donut.
Yeah.
Ulster just seemed to be that hole in the middle, that no funding, no money was pumped into the money, all went out around the outskirts. And I'm just wondering, again, when you're talking about certain developments and things, again, are we in the centre, even with Lough Neagh as well, fresh water, whatever, you know, it's an add-on, maybe it's not being focused on as much, maybe I'm wrong, but I just...
So much of the land obviously in Northern Ireland is privately owned, and therefore to get landowners to maybe do something in the public interest or to deliver environmental public goods on their land, we need to incentivise them to do so. So agriculture funding is a huge one. £330 million roughly goes to agriculture every year in Northern Ireland, and we want to see that money continuing to go to agriculture, but repurposing what they're doing with it. So things like peatland restoration, maybe enabling access where that is appropriate, and helping to restore habitats on farm. So, you know, I think there's a huge pot of money there that could be repurposed to deliver a lot of these public benefits that we're talking about.
I think I would also encourage Ulster Council and any other councils in this area to avail of funding.
So do you work in this area?
I work for the Northern Environment Agency.
Okay, sorry. That's useful context, thank you.
Sorry. No, I'm off duty here.
Sorry for talking.
Never off duty.
You know, we're just finishing off, you know, about 4 or 5 years of interreg funding, 2 fantastic projects, RSPB led on one of the projects, and another just wonderful funds made available by the EU. We have continued to be very generous, and we have €40 million now assigned for restoration of wetland habitat species. Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon and Moneymore Council were involved in both a whole range. Moneymore were involved in
Can, yeah, they were the lead, yeah.
Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon were involved in a number of the interreg projects.
Yeah.
So the councils have a key role.
Did anybody hear from the council?
I don't think so.
Just out of curiosity?
I don't think so. We see that the councils have a really important role to play, because they're kind of trusted broker who need to be availing of any of the money that comes available, and also have more opportunities, I think, to get community buy-in, and probably are more trusted than central government in it. So there are, if you're talking to anybody in the councils, there are opportunities and stakeholder events coming on in the next week or two for this Peace Plus monies, the 40 million that we have for restoration. So we would love, I'm a local, so I would love to see a lot more of that money, because we have loads of peatland habitats and other wetland habitats.
It's just a pity. I thought the council would have been automatically sort of being a part of
Again, I think we're kind of trying to, and we're trying to encourage the department to get the councils more involved in the biodiversity strategy and all of these things, because I think that down in the south, Malcolm Millen has just ensured that all of the county councils have biodiversity officers in place. Again, we used to have, but that
They're going to be able to make the contacts with
they
Yeah.
the groups, they work with local community groups, working with local landowners, so we would be really keen to see councils playing much more.
Did you want to?
Twice the amount of money.
Does anyone else have a? So yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have a? Because otherwise, I think we're coming to 8:15. There's still some nibbles available at the back. You're not allowed to leave unless you've had at least 2 fish fingers or whatever. Hopefully, it's sustainable. But before we go, I'd just like you. This hasn't been a debate, but it's really nice if you make a sort of 2-minute closing statement. Some final thoughts really to leave people with. Who should I put on the spot?
Yeah. I think I'd just pick up. We've had a good debate and I've learned stuff tonight, and hopefully I'm not alone in that. One other point I just pick up and inject. I know in closing arguments you're not meant to pick up new points, but I'll break that rule as well. Is the way we develop, the way where we build stuff, which both impacts the biodiversity. But if we carry on building houses out in the countryside, they not only strain the power grid and all the rest of it, they require people to have cars to get to the services, whether that be the supermarket or the doctors or the council offices or whatever. So why do we keep insisting on doing that? And I do mean we, because the planners will vet an application against planning policy, and planning policy about homes in the countryside, PPS 21, is pretty tight. If you go up to Donegal, you see what not tight is like. But we keep putting houses out there, we keep building those houses. There's loads of empty homes in our towns. Go to Downpatrick, go to Armagh, go to Carrickfergus, all of these empty terraced houses that became shops between the walls. They'll never be shops again. In the right size houses for the housing units we're getting, we're living in smaller households, in easy reach of the shops and the bus station and the doctors and all the rest of it. Why aren't we doing something about that? But we're carrying on building detached homes in the countryside which tick none of the boxes. So again, that's back to us as society thinking about the compromises, back to that word compromise we're willing to make. That's not me as a civil servant trying to say it's not my fault, Gov, what about you guys? But it is a real challenge for us all, I think, and shows the sort of trade-offs we're going to have to decide on.
Thank you. I feel guilty as someone who lives in a detached house in the countryside.
And so you should.
Mine is old, so that's okay. I don't feel
mine's even older. 1697 our house. So fortunately, it's not listed. Can I?
This lady at the back there.
My son has a question.
Oh, right. Yeah, fine. Go on then.
Just a question about how are you going to get this into the schools? Because the schools only go over, like, I know this here might sound weird, but the schools only go over the big things, like go over the economic crisis. They don't go over the wee small details that create some of the biggest impacts. For example, some cows. They don't go over that there, and they need to teach them at a young age. Because you learn how to do English at a young age, but it's very hard to learn a different language at an older age group.
Right. Well, that's a really good point. So maybe, Annika, if you can address that in your 2 minutes.
So there's a new sort of thinking about something called carbon literacy, and it's all about actually trying to improve everybody, whether it's children or ourselves or older people, anybody, to be able to talk about climate change, to be able to understand what it means locally, as what it means globally, about the things that you can personally do, what you can do as a community. And so that there's a kind of movement starting with that. And some schools are kind of getting involved in that through other programs like eco schools and so on. It's just taking a bit of time. The one thing I noticed, I've got kids at 2 different schools. Each school and each teacher does it so differently. So if you have a teacher that's really passionate about it, they'll actually teach a lot. So part of it now is for us to kind of enable those teachers to deliver, more of that, and to let you guys then have the right voice to be able to talk about it. And that actually comes back to the point when I started about eco-anxiety and feeling like, can you do things? I think it's very important that we're teaching people what we can do. And we were talking about resilience. That was a good sort of conversation. To me, resilience is all about diversity, the breadth of things that we have. And at a very simple level, most people have some sort of outdoor space, even if it's literally like a windowsill that you can put a box on, and you can put different plants in that help pollinators, different wild bees and things like that. If you have a garden or more space outdoors, you can do even more. You can plant some trees and you can put in a wildlife pond. All those things seem small, but if everybody did them, that immediately makes our landscape more wildlife friendly, and it provides all those little stepping stones as species need to move with climate change, and it lets new things come in and new things move on, and it lets everything join up, so it provides much more resilience across the whole landscape. So I think, sometimes we do need to, we have to push government to do as much as we can, but certainly in Northern Ireland, we can't wait for government. So you have to do anything you can do yourself. So even if you go to a garden centre, check the compost, because the amount of it that is still has peat in it, which is surprising, you have to be really quite careful. And as consumers, what are you eating? We've noticed that the younger generations are eating less meat and are eating slightly less dairy, which actually is really great for their carbon footprint. We can all make tiny little changes in how we eat that actually has a big impact on the emissions. So I think, the take-home message for me is always, what can I do in lieu of waiting for government to do things, and how can we join up together to make a bigger difference across the landscape? Last little thing, don't forget the sea. Everybody tends to, because it's out of sight. But we've talked a lot about peatland restoration. There's also huge amounts that we can do with salt marsh, seagrass, native oyster reefs. We have all of that within our marine environment. We need to kind of make sure that we're looking after that as well. And sea level rise is going to mean that, the sea is encroaching often on farming land, and we have to have difficult conversations about letting bits of land go, because that land might form things like salt marsh that actually suck down carbon and are really wildlife friendly as well, and provide some sort of buffer of more storm events and flooding in the coast. So we have to remember to join all those things up.
Excellent points. Thank you for that. Jonathan?
Yeah, no, it's been a really fascinating discussion. We've covered a diverse set of topics, which has been great. I think for me in all of this, we've talked about policy, we've talked about politics, the economy. For me, the big thing is community, and not forgetting about community and the importance of people and citizens in all of this. So if any of our climate action is going to work, any of our nature restoration, reaching any of our targets, we're not going to do it without people. So for me, we need to remember community. And the other thing is, if you get an elected representative around your door, I say this from a campaigning organisation, don't let them off the hook. They rarely come round the door now, they certainly don't come round my door. But when they come round your door, hold them to account, ask them some tricky questions, and I think all too often our politics boils down to green and orange. No, let's talk about these issues, critical issues that are going to impact on future generations, like the climate and biodiversity crisis. So get active, get campaigning, get involved, join an NGO and be part of that movement, because we need a big movement of people if we're going to hold our political masters to account.
Thank you. I think that's a round of applause for all. And that's it. Thanks again to Springhill. Is there still food at the end?
There's some donuts.
There's some donuts. No, I don't think we need to go to Lidl. But thanks for hosting us. It's been very kind of you, and we've really appreciated the beautiful historic space you've got here too. So thanks very much. Okay, thank you.